Next, we have David on how to better be a designer, discussing design approach and mindset, and how it differs from methods like UX and Agile, and how you can be a more conscious and a better designer. Welcome, David.
Hello and good morning to those of you who are in North America. Good afternoon in Europe, and good evening elsewhere, even good night in other parts of the world. So let's begin. Slide. Yeah. So this, what this presentation is about is, in some ways it's obvious, and yet often it's not so obvious to people that you are actually a designer. Everybody is a designer, and we spend our time, we spend our lives designing things, but we're often not conscious of it. And indeed, you can see many situations where people have done what is meant to be design, and the consequences make you shake your head and you wonder what they were thinking when they were designing it. And of course they weren't thinking. And so that's what part of the theme this morning or today. Here's a little provocation for you. I'm going to speak for roughly 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions and discussions. And here's a fun thing for you to think about as we're doing it. What's an example of bad design? And in your view, what makes that design bad? So this is very much in contrast to some of the other presentations you may have seen. This is a big picture presentation. It's really very much about what is design thinking and how to be a better designer as a result, if you think in those terms. I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I basically do three things. One is I try to exercise some degree of leadership in the design community. I do practitioner accessible research. I wrote a book in 2018 called Design Thinking at Work, which is about how design works in business organizations. And I work a lot with designers and design labs, both in-house corporate ones and independent ones. I am a professor and I teach a course called Innovation and Design in the Gustavson School of Business. My background is in business, and I also do a ton of executive education in the area too. I also then have some community engagement. I'm a board member and past chair of Academics Without Borders, where we teach in disadvantaged countries, developing countries around the world, to try and help them with their development. And I work with the Brand Trust Index also at the Gustavson School. My background, as I mentioned, is a business background. So I actually started my career by working in marketing with Unilever and in advertising with Young and Rubicon. But after I went back to school, did a PhD, became an academic, I started to get interested in design and what it meant for business. And so I decided I wanted to learn that by spending time at different design schools. So I sort of did a little deal where I would teach them, their students, business, and then I would absorb everything I could about design. And these are some of the places that I've engaged with: OCAD in Ontario, TUDelft in the Netherlands, IIT Institute of Design in Chicago, CIDIM in Mexico, and Dossier Creative here in Vancouver. So that's, so my idea has been to expose myself to the design world. So let's step back then. What is design, and how is it different from design thinking? Well, first of all, there's this, the image there is of Nobel laureate Herbert Simon, and he wrote a book in the 1960s called, sorry, name escapes me as it does sometimes, but the Sciences of the Artificial, that's it. And he said that everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing solutions into preferred ones. Right? So you are, by that definition, you're designing when you make your breakfast, right? Just because you don't have breakfast and you want to have breakfast, and therefore you put something together that is your design of breakfast. Now you can have something as simple as a piece of toast and peanut butter, or you can design an elaborate gourmet breakfast. But that's a design choice that you make, whatever you're doing. So then to move on, it really is, design is this this activity that goes from really, really big picture things to the micro things. So it's about, as Bruce Mao, the designer, said in an exhibition on massive change in the early 2000s, it's not about the world of design, it's about the design of the world. Literally, we're designing the world as we live in it. But it's also micro things, so that we've seen a great victory of design in the past year, which is the astounding design and discovery of the vaccines to combat COVID-19. Now that there's been a ton of both technical and non-technical work that's gone into it. And in many ways, the biggest challenge we're left with now, at least in the developed world, is not so much the technical design of it, but actually getting people to take the vaccine. So there's some design issues there in terms of how do you set up the vaccine centers, but also how do you communicate with people, and how do you empathize with their point of view. So the other thing that design is about users. So it's about, first of all, on the one side it's about changing things, and the other side is about preference. So, you know, for a business audience and for a government audience, yeah, it's about changing things in ways that appeal to users. So what's not to like? It's a good thing from a business perspective and from a government perspective. So then, why is it that we end up designing stupid things? This is one of my examples of bad design. Fire exit only, please close the door quietly as guests may be sleeping. So as I've said, everything is designed, communications, products, services, and systems, yet we often don't realize that we're designing it. So we don't put a lot of thought into it, and we design accidentally, not mindfully. And one of the messages I'd like you to take from this presentation is the idea that we need to be mindful that we are actually designing as we go through an activity. Here's a nice positive example of design. This is GE, which has decided to work on not the technical side of MRI, that's what of a MRI machine, magnetic resonance imaging. That's, you know, that technology is well established. What they're working on is the user experience. And so what they've invented is what's called the GE Adventure Series. And what you can see here is and it's a simple matter of adding decals to an MRI, and they've turned it into a pirate ship. And the idea here is that the kid goes with a parent into the MRI room, and the nurse, if she's really into this, will wear a little pirate's hat and say, welcome to the pirate experience. We'd like you to lie on the gangplank. Now, stay really still in case the pirates see you. And then they go through the experience, and then the child gets off the gangplank or the plank, and then they can choose a toy from the pirate's chest. So it becomes a fun experience. That sounds like it's cute, and it sounds like it's fun. It's also pretty hard-nosed. The person who introduced me to this was the director of patient experience at Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto. And he said to me, do you know how much we spend on sedating kids to go through experiences like MRI every year? And it was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. The point of this was that it reduced the need to sedate kids, right? Because they weren't so terrified of the experience. And so in some studies, they found there was an 80% saving in sedation costs. I showed this to a friend who's an anesthesiologist, and he said, hey, yeah, you know what? It's not just the sedation cost, but it's every time you have to sedate a child, you're going to have to call an anesthesiologist, and that's going to hold the process up for at least 15 minutes if there happens to be an anesthesiologist available right now. So you can see there are massive benefits to a simple design tweak if it's done right. So that's a nice user experience piece, but then there's the whole issue of what are called wicked problems. And wicked problems are those problems in the world where the biggest issue is actually figuring out what the problem is. We're trying to define the problem. So things like, K-12 curriculum, world peace, climate change, those are wicked problems. And even at a lower level, you can find, a wicked problem is forest fires, for example, that we're suffering from here in British Columbia. Tim Brown, who is the CEO of the design firm IDEO, argued, as have many others, he was one of the earliest and most prominent, that if we're to deal with the massive change that seems to be characteristic of our time, we all need to think like designers. So what does it mean when we say think like designers? Well, this is a study from Richard Buchanan, a famous design professor. And he suggested, look, there are 4 levels to design: communications, material objects, activities and organized services, and systems and environment. We know design typically, traditional way we think about design is communications and material objects. So you get your curtains designed for your home. That is a material object. An advertising agency develops a Facebook posting. That is a communications piece. The bit that's new about design thinking are these 2 levels, the activities and organized services. So that is, for example, designing the experience for those who've got to go to a vaccine center. What happens when they arrive? Who do they see first? What kind of mask do they have to wear? Do we give them a new mask? Do they have their own mask? What kind of information do we take from them? How do they interact with people? And so on. So you sort of can deconstruct the service experience and design it in ways that achieve certain goals, right? So that's or at a bigger level, a theme park like Disneyland is the product of very meticulous design and really understanding who people are that go there and what kind of experience Disneyland wants to deliver to them. And then at this higher level, it's systems and environments. So it's really understanding then things like the global financial system, for example. How do we design the global financial system? What goals do we want to achieve? Who are the stakeholders involved in that? What are their interests? What do they want? So there are all these considerations, and all of these are design activities, but not necessarily what we traditionally think of as design. So that is rooted in a way of thinking, and I tend to try and make it as simple as possible. As both a problem-solving process and a mindset. On the left, you'll find a lot of different models of how design thinking works. They all have really 3 important things in common. One is framing, and that is really understanding what the problem is that you're dealing with. Another is empathizing, and that's understanding the users and stakeholders that are involved. And the third is making solutions. So it's actually the rapid prototyping that some of you in the tech industry will be very familiar with. But it's also a mindset. I got this quote from an interviewee that I spoke to early on in my research in design, and I thought it captured very well. A way of approaching problems in the world that begins from a point of optimism, that there's a solution and it's a matter of us reaching it. It builds on that with this idea of mind of a child, the ability to be open to whatever the world is going to tell you, and coupling that with an attitude of wisdom, recognizing evidence for what it is and acting on it. So it's a kind of a critical thinking, creative thinking, and action. Those are the sort of things that are really characteristic. So another example of, and this is again, building out of users, Procter & Gamble in the early 2000s decided that their product range was fairly limited. Procter & Gamble is a company that produces packaged and bottled detergents primarily. And they went out to look at, without any particular goal in mind, just to watch how people use their floor cleaning products. And they found that this was an incredibly involved process. It involves sort of putting on special clothes, getting out the mop from the darkest corner in the house, and essentially moving dirt around. And by looking at that, watching the patterns and seeing just what a pain in the neck washing floors was, they then eventually came around to introducing the Swiffer, which is one of their most successful products ever. And that was through understanding users. What's so different then about design thinking from traditional ways of thinking? Here are a few things. One is that it integrates thinking and making. So if you think about thinking as on two axes, one is the symbolic to the actual and the real, and the other is the analytic to which is breaking things apart, to the synthetic, which is putting them together. So let me show you, if we could take a number of professional fields, and you'd say, well, law and a bit of both, a bit of analytics, synthetic, but veering more on the analytic side. Science, theoretical science is very much symbolic and analytic. So that tends to be more in the real domain, but again, very analytic in terms of its process. Where does design fit with this? Well, it's down here, right? So it tends to be in the domain of the synthetic, which is putting things together, and the real, which is making things material. So those are some differences there. Sorry, let's move on here. Another way, those of you again in the tech industry will be very familiar with the waterfall model of problem solving, which is where you move progressively from problem to solution. You gather data, you analyze data, you formulate a solution, you implement a solution. Well, there's one big shortcoming, one big problem with that if you're dealing with an ill-defined, wicked problem, which is that you don't know what the problem is to begin with, so you don't know where to gather data. So what designers do, instead of doing that linear approach, is they do this. Let's see here. There we go. They do this. They move from problem to solution. They say, oh, wait a minute, the solution that we tried here didn't work. Why didn't it work? If we can understand why our solution didn't work, then we might have a better insight on what the problem itself is, and so on, and back and forward. As you iterate, you get closer to what the true problem is, and then you get, and your solutions get better. So it's this iterative process. Those of you who are familiar with Agile may wonder, well, yeah, you know, I've seen a lot of this with Agile, so what's the difference? Agile, and it deals with well-defined problems, where essentially you're asked to develop a system or a setup for a particular project. Design thinking works with undefined, ambiguous problems. When I talk to my students, I will say, take a look at public transport. I'm not necessarily give them anything to work on, and they'll go and they'll find a problem in public transport that they want to solve, right? So it's all about ambiguity and working with what's undefined. Both design and Agile use iterative process. In design, it tends to be rapid prototypes in any form. They don't have to be online. They don't have to be wireframes or mock-ups or anything like that. They're literally physical prototypes that you can hold in your hand a lot of the time. Usually Agile is for software development, where the design thinking is a much broader thing. It deals with wicked problems, services, experience, product strategies, and so on. So it's a much broader landscape, if you like. Both design and Agile engage users. What designers are trying to do is really not just see what designers want or need, but try to understand the stuff that users themselves don't understand. So to understand what their underlying motivations and context are, and to do that, then they can predict where they might go next. There's a nice example in Sydney. If any of you live in Sydney or have been to Sydney, there's an area called King's Cross, and this is from the University of Technology, Sydney. King's Cross is an area where thousands of young people outside of COVID times gather to go to clubs. And in the past, it's had one of the problems with it is that it's led to some bad behavior, too much drinking, some people urinating in the streets, and fights breaking out. And so for years, what the city and the police have done has been to essentially round up the young people, suburban kids, stick them in jail overnight, and then send them home in the morning. So a design team from the University of Technology, Sydney, decided to take a look at this and to work in a rather different way. Instead of saying, well, these young people are criminals, they went out and said, let's hear from the people who go to the clubs and let's understand their world. And in doing so, and walking around the area, understanding what people were looking for, trying to do, they found a number of really obvious problems. One was that there were actually no street toilets, right? So if you wanted to use a toilet, you had to queue up to get into a club and pay whatever entrance fee there was. So yeah, naturally people use the streets and the alleys. Another was that the subway system closed down at 1 o'clock, whereas the whereas the clubs closed down at 4 o'clock a.m. So when people came out with a lot of drink on board, there was nowhere to go. They hung around the streets, got into fights, etc., etc. So by just reframing things, they were able to bring in some fairly simple interventions. They could provide people with directions to a local suburban train. There weren't subways, but there was a suburban train and it was about a 20 minutes walk away. They actually created little pop-up street toilets, which were over manhole covers, et cetera, et cetera. So there were a number, and they also had night buses that would take people out to various suburbs. So by looking at the problem from users' perspective, not from the perspective of the police in the city, they were able to come up with some very original solutions that really had an impact on the problem. Einstein is reputed to have said, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on the solution, I would spend the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask. Once I know the proper question, I could solve the problem in less than 5 minutes. I think Einstein was a designer. That's very much what designers do. They focus on understanding the problem in depth before they, not before, but they do that through developing prototypes. So, as I've said, you are a designer, and here are some thoughts, given what I've said, on how you might become a better one. First of all, be mindful. Obviously, and I hope as a result of this presentation, you realize that you are designing. You are designing for someone, a user, or whatever, whether you mean to or not. And consider users first. I think those of you who are, again, in the development industry, software development industry, you're fairly familiar with that message. But also think about stakeholders and systems. So in design, it's not always obvious who the user is. And there are many situations where there are multiple stakeholders and you need to make trade-offs between them, or not necessarily make trade-offs, but even integrate them to come up with solutions that will work for everyone. Like the Sydney folks, don't accept the problem as given. Try to look for a different perspective. And usually that's a user perspective in some form. Proceed iteratively, be prepared to backtrack. So in other words, you'll get down the road, and my students do all the time, you'll get down the road towards the solution and start to realize that you haven't got the problem right. And that's a tough thing to do, but you have to backtrack and re-examine where you are. The design is a very reflective exercise. And then feel free to jump to solutions, but hold them loosely. So don't consider that you've got the answer when you've got your first solution. We will stop there, and I gave you a little bit of a challenge earlier on to find an example of bad design. If you want to put them into the chat, that is fine, and of course I'm willing to take any other questions that you might have.
Thank you, David. We do have a question. Peggy, do you want to go ahead and read it out loud?
Yeah, so we have a couple questions.
Sure.
The first question we have is, what is the difference between design and architecture in case of systems?
Let me understand the question here. So what is this in the questions?
Yeah.
Design and architecture in case of systems. Let me think very carefully about how to do this. So I would see architecture, at least in the physical world, and I'm not sure whether the the person who's asking the question is referring to the online world or the physical world. In the physical world, architecture is commonly about buildings and urban environments, about physical environments. When we think about design in the physical world, yeah, you have a problem, but the solution is not necessarily building a physical environment. It could be building, well, it could be a virtual environment, or it could be building ways of experiences and ways for people to interact with each other, which are not really physical things. So that would be the conventional view of architecture in the physical world. In the online world, I think the answer there is that, you know, if you're thinking about systems architecture in the online world, that's a solution, right? It's a solution to a particular problem, where what design is all about is trying to understand what is the problem. And yes, the solution may be some form of a system architecture, or it could be some different kind of an intervention. So it's a kind of a broader approach. Hope that addresses the question. Peggy, is there another one?
Yeah, thank you, David. So another question we have is, so how similar or different should we approach the different design problems, whether it's a well-defined or ill-defined problem, in terms of process and mindset?
I think it's actually a question I was about to jump to an answer, because I think there is an answer to that, but I'll back up from what I jumped to in a moment. So the answer I was about to jump to is you have the same process every time, right? Because you don't know when it looks well defined when you get into it, and then you find once you start to dig into it that there are all these aspects to it that are not so well defined. A good example might be if you're trying to make a new safe car. Yeah, that sounds like a straightforward enough proposition, at least from a technical point of view. But when you're doing that, there are multiple different regulations in different parts of the world. There are distribution channels to consider, dealerships to consider, drivers who may not like the trade-offs that are involved in making a safe car. So what may appear to be a straightforward problem is often way more complex. So the quick answer is you should have the same process and mindset as you go into everything. The issue is that, of course, some problems are simple, and then it seems to a lot of people to be a bit cumbersome to go into a process of design every time you've got a simple problem. I think the way to deal with that, if you think about my diagram about the waterfall process, which is from Jeff Conklin, it really is do the first couple of iterations and see if this really is the simple problem you think it is, and then go ahead and solve it. So it's really about doing the investigation first. The next question I have, is there an ideal ratio of designer to developer in a software company? I'm not a software guy, so I probably can't give you a number for that. My answer to it is that I think it's probably a bit dangerous to say some people are designers and some people are developers. You know, your developers also need to have something of a design mindset, even if they're not tasked with the problem-solving aspects of design. Having that you know, the responsiveness and the willingness to iterate that designers have is extremely helpful for software development, just as much as it is for software design.
Great. Thank you so much, David.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, thank you, everybody. I see that Corinne has put in the chat, put my email in the chat. More than happy to follow up if you are interested at any time. And thank you, Peggy and Corinne, for the opportunity to do this. And thank you, everybody who's out there listening to it. I hope you found something useful in it.